We're working with techniques on how to draw trend lines, and I'm showing you the usefulness of actually drawing trend lines from high to low or low to high. Here's another instance where we're working with a much shorter term time frame. If you recall, the previous price chart we were working with was the US bond price chart, and that was of the weekly chart level. Well, here's a simply 60-minute price chart of the E-mini Dow. And again, simply from an extreme, here's a low, to the high of the move, and then take a parallel to the most extreme portion of the move, which would be this low right here. And as you can see, when prices begin breaking below it, that signals that the previous move is indeed done. You can actually utilize this approach with much sharper moves as well, i.e. this decline here. When prices begin moving above it or closing above it, then that's a good indication the previous move is indeed done. Now here's a question for you. When is a trend line break a trend line break? Some people like to utilize closes above or below trend lines as an indication of a trend line break, but for me, what I like to do is I like to utilize, just to go back to this example here, I like to see price action begin moving above or below a trend line on a high or low basis. And what I mean by that is, for example, right here we actually did see some closing price action below this lower trend line here, but I don't really constitute that a legitimate break of the trend line. What I like to see personally is new highs or new lows above or below the trend line. And as you can see on this bar right here, the high of this bar was below the trend line. So this bar right here I consider a legitimate break of the previous trend line. Let me move the chart over and expand that a bit and readdress the question to make my point as clear as possible. When is a trend line break? When does a trend line break actually occur? What constitutes a legitimate trend line break? Well, in this instance, what I'd like to see is not closing price action above or below a trend line, but new highs or new lows above a trend line. And again, the reason why is, like for example in this instance here, we did close below this trend line. However, it wasn't until 2 or 3 price bars later, right here, where the high of the bar is actually below the trend line. This, I believe, constitutes a legitimate break. However, this would be a false break. So that's one way you can actually use trend lines to identify when prices indeed break a trend line and what constitutes, again, a legitimate trend line break. Okay, now let's go back to our example, and what I'm doing is just showing you briefly some examples of how to draw trend lines and how useful they are, drawing them from a high to low or low to high. So what we'll go back to here, we'll go back to our original example, from a low to a high, take a parallel of this line, or the slope of that advance, and move it to the right until it actually captures the most extreme portion of that move. And as you can see, when prices began moving below it, this bar right here, the high of the bar was below the trend line, signaled indeed a very nice sell-off to the downside. And you can actually utilize this technique with much more impulsive moves. It's the same approach. And as you can see, these few bars over here, the lows of these price bars were above this secondary trend line that we drew, and that essentially confirmed the previous move was indeed done. And with the subsequent advance, again, once prices begin closing below the trend line, and when the high of the price bars are below the secondary trend line, that indicates that we've basically seen an end to the previous price move and we're beginning a new price move. And it's a very simple approach, yet very effective. As you can see at this price bar right here, the low of the price bar was above the secondary trend line, thereby leading to an advance. you can see here as well. So it's just another simple little technique on how to draw a trend line that I think you can actually garner a lot of very important information from as well. So as you can see in this instance, the low of the price bars are above the secondary trend line, arguing that this is indeed a legitimate trend line break and that prices may move up for a while. So while you can draw trend lines from high to high or low to low, different extremes, you can take parallels of those lines, creating price channels. You also can garner a lot of information from a trend line by drawing them from high to high or low to low.